Welcome to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and we're excited about this week's show. We have with us Trevor Koot, who is a business leader and distinguished history, with a distinguished history in the real estate industry. His work has helped to further establish and evolve BC's 6 real estate boards. He now holds the title of CEO of the British Columbia Real Estate Association. Welcome to the show, Trevor.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by Tim Hudak, who is no stranger to our show over the last several seasons, having made the leap from 21 years of service in provincial government as the member of provincial parliament for Niagara Region, a cabinet minister, culminating as well as the leader of the Ontario Progressive Conservative Party. He left the frying pan of politics and jumped right into the fire of real estate as the CEO for the Ontario Real Estate Association. And during his tenure, he's helped shape public image and direction in the real estate industry to strengthen the relationship between organized real estate policymakers and protecting the goals and interests of millions of Ontarians who sought or continue to seek home ownership. Tim, that's a mouthful. Yes, I kind of read it a little bit, but glad to have you back on our show.
Yeah, thanks, Arif and Mike, both. Very generous introduction. Great to be on Hitting Home. And you're right, 21 years of politics at the provincial level that got me ready for real estate politics. So I'm ready to take some swings in the big league now.
Absolutely. So, gentlemen, with you both here, I think Mike and I have the market cornered on the real estate brain trust as
For sure.
it pertains to all of the challenges that Canadians face in regard to housing availability, affordability, etc. And we're going to solve all the problems in Canada over the next hour. Buckle up.
Buckle up. And despite the geographic differences between Ontario and British Columbia, I mean, they're worlds apart, there are a lot of similarities, and there's certainly a lure for Ontario residents to BC. We see a lot of movement that way. We also see a lot of movement back by some of those same people, and a lot of people who move from BC to Ontario for work-related issues, for family-related issues. And I'm curious, with the changes we're seeing with housing prices going up in the recent years, as well as how technology is shaping and changing how and where we can work, do you think this love affair between BC and Ontario is going to continue? I'll ask you, Trevor, first.
Yeah, well, I think the impact that COVID had on the migration of people within Canada, certainly around the world, obviously, but even within Canada, is starkly different than the migration patterns that people had before the global pandemic. And some of that was influenced by, just the limitations on travel and the inability to move across regions. But some of it was positive influence, which prompted people moving to rural areas as opposed to urban markets in order to seek greater opportunity around having their daycare as well as their office, as well as their entertainment all within their house, rather than being in a downtown core area. And we certainly saw those migration patterns. It's more than anecdote. We saw statistics to support that.
Yeah, you said love affair. Trevor is a very handsome and fit fella, but that may be a little strong. But I do like him a lot. Yeah, I'll add on what Trevor had to say there. There are a lot of similarities in your question at a fundamental level. I mean, a comparison is very valid where you have both in BC and Ontario some very dominant economic areas that have had a significant increase in housing prices, up to the spring of this year. Toronto and the GTHA, of course, and Vancouver and Lower Mainland. That will, confront politicians' decisions about do you make policy for that one area or the province as a whole. We have rural areas that have done well, but the market can be different in those areas. The other major difference, the major similarity, I would say, between the two is that they're very high demand markets internationally. So when you have immigration, as Trevor was talking about, migration from within Canada, the group of millennials, which will be the largest block of Canadians in our history coming into the housing market, and a lot of foreign students, those all put pressures on the demand side of the equation. So while we may be on different parts of the country, some very similar public sector dynamics taking place.
Yes. So I'll ask you, Trevor, actually, because you mentioned it. a big variable that came into play all of a sudden during COVID or due to COVID was the fact that employers were no longer restricted by geographic limitations in terms of seeking out and recruiting the best talent. And so how did that impact your local area or your provincial market there?
I can speak provincially. We had the availability of technology that helped us monitor some of that. So an application called BuyerPath when I was in the Kootenay and Kamloops markets, and we were able to track exactly where buyers were coming from. And we saw a 7% increase of traffic from urban migration to rural during kind of pre-pandemic compared to post-pandemic. So we did see those anecdotes actually play out. I think, personally, I think it's a little bit of a pendulum. I think there's going to be a little bit of a correction coming back, and we're already starting to see that. You know, employers kind of either mandating or creating a strong environment for employees to be back in the workplace. And I don't know what impact long term that's going to have on some of those people who migrated to more rural settings. But I do see there being a little bit of a correction coming.
So not only did that allow employers to have more flexibility or greater flexibility in terms of talent recruitment, what I'm hearing, Tim, is that it also allowed employees or employers to retain their employees even when they chose to leave traditional areas.
Yeah, that's true. And one similarity I left out last time when I talked about the public sector, to win elections in Canada, you really have to win in the Lower Mainland and in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So you can see the federal government, which will cater policies around housing, because that was such a hot issue in the last election campaign.
Yeah.
To your question, similar phenomenon in Ontario, Arif, where we saw a significant number of people leaving the urban areas to live in semi-urban or rural areas during the pandemic. I suspect that was some flexibility of working from home and reporting to the headquarters in the big city. I think it was other people who changed their lifestyle or retired early, because we did see that moderate as we came out of the pandemic at the end of the day. Ultimately, our belief is that people like cities will look for the dynamic of a city, the excitement of being in a city, the entertainment, shopping, restaurants, all that, the networking opportunities, and those that like small towns will tend to gravitate that way as well. Probably on the margin, because of work from home or at least hybrid, you'll see a bit more of a shift they would have had otherwise, but it has restored, as Trevor said, to a pretty even balance here in the province.
Mm-hmm. And in regard to policy and how it's created by our two upper levels of government, provincial and federal, one thing that's shared between BC and Ontario is we have two large predominant cities, Toronto, of course, and Ontario, Vancouver and BC. And when we listen to and watch and read our national media, anything with regards to real estate, more often than not, focuses on numbers and statistics and actions in regard to those two cities. It's frustrating when you're a smaller municipality an hour away, as we are in Barrie, from that bigger city. It's kind of like you want to get a weather report and you want your local weather report. You don't want the weather report for Toronto when you're in Barrie. I'm curious, given all of that, do you think that has an impact and an influence on the decision makers and the policy makers when they're forming their policy for real estate? Do you think they tend to maybe focus too much on those bigger municipalities and maybe some of the smaller ones are left out in those decisions? I'll ask Tim first on that one.
Oh, I've been there. It is true. There's a constant tension, in the legislature or within a caucus of any party, where you've got those that are concerned about the big city, and then you have folks in the surrounding areas, and then there'll be a dynamic that plays out to say, what policy is important to advance or to try to find a compromise. And the media is increasingly focused on the big cities, so that can drive decision making as well. Any good government, has to be conscious of all corners of the province and try to develop policy to cater it that way. In the past, it's gone off the rails. For example, we tend to have, because of the growth issues around Toronto, a one-size-fits-all straitjacket on developing new land. And that may make sense around Toronto or York region, for example, but if you're northern, southwestern, eastern Ontario, there's a lot of land available, and there should be more flexibility to develop it. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, we've helped to drive that point by talking to MPPs And the Ford government has brought an approach that gives more flexibility to local mayors and councils to reflect the local culture and availability of land.
Trevor?
I think the advantage that we have in BC is we don't see a lot of new regulation or policy around the trading practices of realtors or development of real estate in British Columbia. And I said that with 100% sarcasm. I see that Tim is not laughing, so now I'll say that that was a sarcastic comment. We completely appreciate and understand the environment of being hit with new regulation. I mean, in British Columbia, it's all the time. The regulator is taking information and direction from the government, and government rightly is trying to react to what's happening in the marketplace and do the best that they can to protect the consumer and to ensure that we're building that affordability by creating supply. All of that said, there is an extremely difficult balance when it comes to policy that is provincial in nature, that balances, as Tim was pointing out, the rural things that affect rural buyers and sellers and developers versus urban. It is an extremely difficult job, and we see that imbalance all the time when policy comes into play.
So, Trevor, I'm just going to jump on something that you said there, and all sarcasm aside, recognizing that there is a relationship between federal and provincial regulators and how it impacts your market. But if my recollection is even remotely accurate, I remember just a few short years ago, certainly during a similar spike in activity and therefore surge in home value or perception of home value, that the government, I believe it was the federal government, came out quite strong against what they perceived as foreign investors, particularly targeting or looking to settle and move their cash out of Asia, China in particular, and into the Vancouver area marketplace. And they targeted it as, this is the reason why nobody can afford a home in the area. And it was a very blunt statement. Now, again, I will be very careful to say this is my opinion. This is what I perceived as what was going on. I'd like to think I watched the data and I watched the facts. And in my opinion, when it all shook out after things sort of settled down, it came out that was a very small percentage of activity.
Less than 5%.
It was less than 4 or 5%. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, our data at the time. So when all of that conversation was happening, a lot of it was around money laundering and anti-money laundering and the role that FinTrack plays on a federal level, but also where that was playing in the provinces. And our provincial government at the time was echoing that narrative that there was a high level of foreign investment. That foreign investment was dirty money, quote unquote, coming into the province that was driving up prices and making affordability out of the reach of the average homeowner. The Cullen Commission, a big investigation into money laundering in the province related to real estate, high-value vehicles, casinos, of course, that was the big one. That kind of, not even kind of, it reassured that what the BCREA was saying at the time. At the time, foreign investment was about 1%, just over 1% in British Columbia. Now we're at 0.3%. A lot of that affected by COVID, of course. And all of that play has kind of quieted down in British Columbia. The fact that affordability was related to foreign investment, that's no longer the case. That's no longer what the narrative is. It truly is related to supply and demand. We need more supply. Everybody's aware of that. How are we going to do it?
Excellent, gentlemen. We do have to take a quick break, but when we come back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, we will continue to be joined by Trevor Koot, who is the CEO of the British Columbia Real Estate Association, and Tim Hudak, who's the CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. And we will be right back after this break. back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif, and once again, we are thrilled to be joined by both Trevor Koot, who's the CEO of the British Columbia Real Estate Association, and Tim Hudak, who's the CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Thanks for being with us here, gentlemen. I'll get right into it. We are in a period of, after 3 years of steady home price increases in both BC and Ontario, seeing some, having seen some escalation. We are on the sort of the downside of it right now, certainly here in Ontario, and there is talk of recession. My opinion, no surprise. There's quite an effort put forth to calm the market through various policy, including interest rate hikes and making it more difficult for people to access home ownership. There's a lot of talk about anxiety, heightened anxiety, and people considering whether or not they're going to be able to maintain home ownership. Forget about get into it. I'll throw that over to you, Trevor. Are you seeing similar concerns and frustrations in British Columbia?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes with uncertainty. I mean, the idea of increasing rates affecting people's understanding of whether they should be in variable or fixed, how long things are going to last, is certainly all indications are going to be that there's going to be some sort of a correction coming in 2023, and is upon us now. But I think the uncertainty of what people's next move should be to navigate that is the biggest challenge. I'll just give my personal anecdote. When I talk to people about these types of environments, it always comes back to buy a home to be a home first. Don't buy it as an investment. If you need a home, then it should be a roof over your head and your children's head first and foremost. And that helps alleviate some of the uncertainties that come down the road. If you're relying on it to be just an investment, it becomes a lot more challenging when there's speculation involved.
So, Tim, what would be the Ontario Tim Hudak perspective on the market we're in now, the changes we're seeing?
Definitely going through a transition right now. Trevor laid out a lot of the fundamentals there, but I'll tell you why I'm an optimist in the intermediate future, let's say it that way. It's not high interest rates are the enemy of real estate, because you can still make a real estate transaction. It happened, we had these rates before, and they're really still not that high compared to history. But it's the uncertainty, as Trevor really laid out. It causes market psychology. People say, well, I'm not sure my dollar's going to go as far. When I'm buying a home, I'll have a higher carrying cost. Maybe I'll wait and see what happens. And sellers are saying, I've seen prices come down from the spring. I won't get what my neighbor got, so they hold on. And as a result, you don't have as many exchanges in the real estate market or limited inventory. But here's why I'm optimistic. There's a lot of underlying fundamental demand in the system. Millennials now, which will be the biggest group of home buyers in the nation's history, are coming of age where they're getting promoted, they're having family, they're settling down, they want to get in the real estate market. Immigration is roaring back to Canada. In 2023, we'll have the most immigrants coming to our country, most settling in BC or Ontario than any time in history. Students are returning to college, including a lot of foreign students who often buy homes as an investment. And lastly, you got the bank of mom and dad, right? These are the boomers, and they've got the greatest wealth in the history of our country, and they deserve it. They work hard, they save their money, but they can help finance for the bank of mom and dad their kids who, Mike and Arif, they love their kids dearly, but they wouldn't mind them seeing move out of the basement, right, to get a place of their own. So that tells me when interest rates stabilize, and we certainly had better news, a week or two ago with rates only going up 50 points instead of 75.
Yeah.
I think you'll see people returning to the market with some confidence. So I can't tell you that's in 2 months or 5 months, but I can tell you in 2 years to 5 years, real estate will be up significantly from where it is today. And I think that is because of that big demand and limited supply in the marketplace. So I'm a medium-term optimist in all this.
Okay. Do you think with that we will see a leveling out of prices? I prefer to call this an adjustment phase that we're in right now, and rightfully so. I mean, even between, say, August of 2021 and January of 2022, we saw prices go up, at rates that usually are over a 2-year period traditionally. So we spiked, and then we've come back down a bit. It's an adjustment. Do you think this adjustment will continue on through 2023, or will it a leveling out? You seem optimistic that the rate increases are going to back away at some point in 2023. I'll ask Tim first, and then I'll ask Trevor.
Yeah, two good points there, Mike. I mean, we're comparing real estate prices today to a really frothy high in the market of February, March of earlier this year. We're still actually pretty much even with what we had last year. And look, the interest rate increase was only 50 basis points. We were expecting to be more aggressive. The markets reacted well to that. It gives a signal the Bank of Canada believes is making good progress on combating inflation. So I think we're in a better scenario than we probably would have guessed a month or so ago. No doubt we'll be in a transitional market for a little while longer, but when that confidence restores, when we get to a level of plateauing of the interest rate increases or even coming down the road, a big increase in demand, and because we have such limited supply, that's going to put a lot of upward pressure on prices.
Yeah, so what I take from, sorry, go ahead, Trevor.
I'll give you the opportunity to keep going, Mike, and just say I completely agree with Tim.
Yeah. And I take from that comment that, and there's the old saying that with change comes opportunity. It couldn't apply more than it does with real estate, and certainly with the scenario where we are now. I mean, you can watch the sky is falling doom and gloom headlines and make your decisions based on that, or you can look a little deeper, talk to a realtor, talk to a professional, talk to a mortgage broker, and you're probably going to be enlightened a little bit and find out it's not as scary as everybody thinks. And again, there's opportunity there.
Okay, so I'm going to play the devil's advocate in all of this, though, gentlemen, and it really is simply this. For a period of, I don't know how many decades, and you guys have the access to the data more than I do in this regard, homeowners or those who were aspiring homeowners went through a period of generational conditioning that said, work hard, put your money away, save it, etc. And we had far fewer ancillary sort of expenses like cell phones and internet and all these other things. But along the way, home ownership was our primary focus. And then starting a family and continuing on that path and that cycle. But over the last 10 plus years, Canadians have been conditioned to believe that acquiring a home came at around prime -9 and at around a 1% interest rate. And that simply was unrealistic. It was an unrealistic expectation for policymakers to lead Canadians to believe for such an extended period of time. So, my opinion, there are those who chose not to follow traditional best practices. Now, here's the challenge that I have, though. In 1 year, look at the differential that we've seen on the bank rate. Look at what we've seen for people who just barely qualified based on accepted policy and accepted criteria to get into home ownership, and they went variable because you'd be a fool not to be in variable over the last 10 years, and now suddenly look what's happened to their cost of ownership in terms of their mortgage. So my concern, I agree with both of you gentlemen that it's, the rates that we're seeing right now are not far-fetched. In fact, they're well below historic highs. However, on a more micro level or more recent level, one, conditioning, and two, the shock of immediate trajectory for new homeowners. And I'm curious, what is the message that we tell those people about the fact that they didn't prepare properly? Trevor?
Things change. That's just the reality of every the environment that we live within, whether it's society and societal expectations and the introduction of platforms that shrink the world, like social media and globalization, or the economic environment that we live within and the expectations from one generation to the next. So. We're just over one generation away from 18 to 24% interest rates, and the memory of people is very short. We adapt very quickly to new environments that we come into, and as a result, when we have 0.25% interest prime, then that becomes the thing that generation knows. The generation that knows 0.25% prime is going to start to understand that that's not an always thing, and I think that as they get comfortable with that and understand that things do change, then habits will change to accommodate it.
Yeah, our federal government. I'm sorry. Did you have a chance to answer that one, Tim? I'm jumping ahead.
I can be
I'm sorry.
I think I also got to give people a bit more credit. No doubt in the short term, and Mike, you said this well earlier on, there's a bit of turbulence. Sometimes a home has multiple offers, sometimes it doesn't. It depends a lot on your listing strategy, I think. So always talk to a real estate professional to get the best advice of how to get the home that you want or to get a good price for your home on the market. You don't want to leave money on the table.
Yeah.
But that's the short-term turbulence. I think we're in long-term. I think people make responsible long-term decisions. It's a great part of Canada's history that every generation had a better shot at owning a home than the parents or grandparents. That's tried and true, right from Confederation to the Depression, the wars, the 70s, all of that. Why is that? Well, it's a proven long-term investment, and it's precious to you because it's where you raise your family. It's where your fondest memories are made, and you can't live in a stock or a bond. And we've shown time and time again that homeowners, all else constant, their kids do better in school, they get better jobs, better health outcomes. It's a fundamental part of our culture. And I don't think that's going to change, and I strongly oppose political policies that try to discourage home ownership. It's a smart investment, and it's good for our communities. And I think people will make the right call when they talk to a professional realtor about their future.
Yeah, and it leads right into my next question, and that is, traditionally the Canadian government has always encouraged home ownership and supported wherever they could home ownership. But as of late, and I would say as of late as the last 3 years, as we saw the run-up on prices, federal government realized they should possibly step in. I wish they hadn't in some areas, but that's another story. But I mean, government with regard to policy can always take a carrot or a stick approach. I think they preferred the stick approach with regards to the housing scenario and affordability. And many of the policies that they've put in place seem to, artificially at least, curb demand. The demand is still there, they're curbing the ability of a lot of people rather than focusing on the real problem, which is supply. So I would ask each of you, do you think our federal government, and to the same degree, our provincial government, actually to a greater degree, our provincial government, are doing what they need to be doing at this point in time to ensure we move forward in a positive direction with regards to housing availability and housing affordability? Anything you might want to add to that you think could be happening? I much appreciate it. And we'll start with Tim on that one.
So you can't tax your way to affordability.
Yeah.
And lazy or greedy governments will often look to put more real estate taxes on properties with some view it's going to bring those values down. And it doesn't. You should not waste any calories. Every available ounce of energy from public policy should be focused on creating more supply. That's what is driving up our prices right until earlier this year and will do so in the future. We built more homes in Ontario. I can't say for BC, but we built more homes in Ontario in the 1970s than we did in the 2000s, for goodness sake. That's nuts. Mm-hmm. And we're paying the price today.
Yeah.
So anything government does should be focused on speeding up the approvals process, eliminating red tape to hold costs down, finding new land available that's not environmentally sensitive for development, allowing property owners to build up on their property, put more properties there, converting government or commercial excess space to residential properties. I mean, Arif, there's a lot of ideas on the table. They just need to have the courage to act on them. I will say that the Ford government's recent legislation, building more homes faster, was probably the most pro-homeownership legislation we've seen in memory. They took a lot of those ideas. I said, good for them. Keep on that path.
Yeah.
Trevor, go ahead, and then we're going to go to break. But go ahead.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. The federal policies, as you pointed out, definitely are typically demand related, and historically, I would say, even up until recently, provincial policy has also been demand related. It's as Tim pointed out, trying to tax our way out of unaffordability. I think that the initiatives, as Tim pointed out again, the recent Ford announcement, certainly what we're seeing from David Eby in kind of pre-talk to his leadership in British Columbia is going to start to move down the path of this is a supply issue. We need policy that incentivizes supply quicker and more of it. I'll leave it there. And
Actually, I think Trevor, we're gonna pick up on that thought anyway with when we come back from the break. But do stay with us for more from Trevor Koot and Tim Hudak on Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. We'll be right back. to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. And again, we are continuing the conversation with Trevor Koot, CEO of the British Columbia Real Estate Association, and Tim Hudak, who is the CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Tim, you sort of planted a seed that you were very pleased to see recent decisions made by the Ford government. You label it as the most progressive and active, if you will, I'm putting words in your mouth, move towards assisting with addressing the supply issue. One of the things that comes to mind in recent years, there's been talk around, certainly in the metropolitan areas, around laneway housing, tiny homes, that kind of thing. But there's also been activity around repurposing existing developments, for example, shopping centers, and building up, not just building out, but taking shopping centers, retail outlets, and building residential over commercial space, that kind of thing. Your thoughts on that? Do we see more of a trend in that direction? And how do we, since we can't invent more land, how do we best address making supply available?
Yeah, you bet. So there are more homes built faster is groundbreaking. It lowers the cost of new home development, particularly targeting lower cost homes for first-time buyers, not-for-profits, and rental housing. It allows property owners to intensify, particularly around subway or transit stations. It also allows people to develop their own property up to 3 units. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. The commercial side that you mentioned, Arif, is not in the bill. It was something we've asked for, but they say it's coming down the pike. So you're exactly right. In day and age with hybrid work arrangements and also more people purchasing online, we expect to see a shrinkage in some commercial areas. The prime office buildings are doing fine, but the secondary ones, the smaller malls, the plazas, probably will have a lot of space. So the government did tell us they're looking at 2 initiatives coming down the pike. One, to use underutilized government space to develop housing targeted at first-time home buyers, and also converting commercial space, like you mentioned, from the plazas, the malls, the parking lots, into residential or mixed use. We like this idea because that's on land that's already surfaced, it's environmentally friendly, and it'll be affordable for average hardworking Canadians.
So, Tim, let me just continue that with one second with you, though. You talked about environmentally friendly, which I think is huge. Obviously, we are paying more attention to climate impact and climate change. Certainly, that's something that we can do in terms of active transportation or getting people to use public transportation, bike lanes, that kind of thing. But you also talked about surplus government assets, buildings, et cetera. And on a previous show, we talked about also brownfield remediation. Now, that obviously comes with a huge price tag in some cases, maybe in every case, I don't know. But speaking about putting an environmental focus on redevelopment, is there a way of doing that in a fiscally responsible manner, but also an environmentally responsible manner?
No doubt about it. I'll give you a couple of examples. We do need, though, let's not lose sight of it, in areas like Simcoe County would be an example of bringing new land into development for housing and for jobs. And you need to make sure it's not environmentally sensitive, but it's a land that's been approved for development. We need to get after that, and the government should incent that by supporting those projects with funding for water and sewer, transit roads. With respect to government buildings, I'll give you a couple of examples. Yeah, it works in cities. And believe it or not, the government of Ontario is the largest landowner in the city of Toronto. Yeah. So you could downsize the footprint of government and turn those spaces into housing. There's a fancy WSIB building right in downtown Toronto. I don't think in this day and age that has to be government jobs. That could be converted to housing or a mixed use. Yeah. But it's the small towns too. So just north of you in North Bay, there's an OPP station, been abandoned for years. One guy comes out with his lawnmower this summer, cuts the grass, but it stays empty on a major transportation route. That could be housing. In Thunder Bay, there's an abandoned hospital that's been closed down for decades right in the middle of town. Man, that could be turned into housing for first-time buyers, for rentals, etc. There's enormous potential. We just have to have the guts to actually get it going, and government policies that incent those redevelopments.
Mm-hmm. Now, Trevor, you've got a slightly different persuasion in British Columbia, and is that something that, compared to Ontario from a political perspective, is that on par, or is there a different approach being used in British Columbia?
Well, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I just want to pivot back to the supply conversation a little bit. The idea around supply is going to be the fundamental thing that drives some of these conversations forward. And as Tim pointed out, some of these other commercial abandoned areas, how does that kind of fit into the equation? Part of the challenge with all of that is there enough incentive for developers from a market perspective to be able to recoup costs and make a living and make a profit? But also something that we're exploring is, are there enough people to build all of the required housing that we need from a supply perspective? Yeah. And then the question is, if we need more people, where are they coming from? And if they come into the country to help us build, they need housing. And it becomes this vicious cycle. So, and this is more probably a plug for Tim and I, but we were extremely proud, the BC Real Estate Association, to partner with the Ontario Real Estate Association and the Canadian Real Estate Association to get the Conference Board of Canada. We funded a research study with the Conference Board to look at exactly how supply is affected with immigration and bringing people in to kind of round out that cyclical environment that we find ourselves in and figure out where those best practices are and what the best case scenario is for addressing the supply side. I'm going to talk very quickly on the environmental side because it's a much bigger play in BC, I think, from the fact that environmental impacts on supply and affordability are not just related to building energy efficient homes. It's, do we have the land and the capacity to build when we're seeing environmental impacts? Last year we saw the entire Abbotsford region, a lot of farmland, a lot of developable land from a residential and other perspective, completely flooded with the atmospheric river that came through and wiped out the Coquihalla Highway. It affected delivery of goods and transportation of goods to many interior municipalities. We see wildfires that are affecting the insurability of homes. When there's a wildfire during wildfire season, the banks stop lending mortgages on properties in that area, even if there's a deal in the pipeline, because they're uninsurable during that time. So environmental impacts are affecting us in different ways, and affordability and supply, and those are all really big conversations that we're having as an industry stakeholder with government and with other stakeholders around affordability.
And I think it's always good to remind the public that when leaders of our industry do interact with government, we're not there to, feather our own nests as realtors here and make things better for our business as an industry. We're there on behalf of Canadians, on behalf of homeowners and would-be homeowners. Well, just this past week, you, Tim, and you, Trevor, and myself, along with 450 or more other representatives from our industry clear across the country, converged on Ottawa for CREA PAC Days. I would ask each of you to give us your thoughts, maybe a quick overview outline on what it is and how you see it, and the significance of this annual event and what it's all about. I will start with you, Trevor.
I'll just simply say it's an alignment of messaging. We have 155,000 realtors across Canada, significant numbers in each of our respective jurisdictions. For Tim and I don't know where that came from, Tim. The reality is those types of environments give us the opportunity to align our messaging, to make sure that everybody is saying the same thing to government, and really to inform the folks within the industry on where the priorities need to be. We had some great messaging. We had some great meetings with members of Parliament throughout that week. And I think having all of those stakeholders in one spot and kind of quote unquote singing from the same song sheet is a big win for us every year.
Yes. Tim, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I can give it from the other side. I mean, having been one of those MPPs when it was done at Queen's Park, I was on the receiving end. And I can tell you, I really look forward to those conversations with my local realtors, and a number of reasons. Number one, I really like talking real estate. It's past hockey and it's past COVID as a top conversation right around the barbecue. Number two, every political representative really loves their community. and they love hearing about who's moving in. People are excited to go there, what's happening with real estate prices. So they naturally bond with realtors because realtors love their communities too, otherwise they wouldn't work them. And number three, there's a lot of mutual respect, I think, at least with the politicians and the realtors, and I'll tell you why. I will say in my 21 years in public life, I didn't see any other professional group as actively involved in the grassroots of their community, helping the Boys and Girls Club, the soccer club, figure skating, women's shelter, what have you, than realtors. Like, they are really roll up their sleeves, get involved. Every time an MPP is at a ribbon cutting or some event, there's realtors hanging around. So they recognize how hard they work. They're generalists in the community, so that advice is actively sought. Plus, they're the only group that has more lawn signs, right, than the politicians. So that's a bonus there too. So there's always a natural connection on information that MPPs deserve. And as Trevor said, if you're singing on the same songbook, you're making an important point about how to get the keys into more hands of homeowners in our country, the MPs are going to listen.
Excellent. And on that note, we do have to go to break real quick, but when we do come back, let's pick up the conversation around local local policymakers and local politicians in relation and discussion with senior levels of government. And I'll give you a bit of a heads up. I do want to talk about the influence of zoning and land use planning decision making, and whether that's going to come from the municipality or from the provincial government. So stay with us for more with Trevor Koot and Tim Hudak on Heading Home with Mike and Arif. Welcome back to Hitting Home with Mike and Arif. Trevor Koot, Tim Hudak, CEOs of your respective real estate associations in British Columbia and Ontario. Glad you're with us. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about federal policy. We've talked about local policy and influencers. We've certainly talked about the similarities and challenges that are shared in jurisdictions. We've covered also the difference between living in major metropolitan centers and also more rural areas. But one of the things that we certainly agree on is, aside from federal policy and aside from monetary policy, one of the biggest challenges that remains is supply, or supply and demand. And Tim, I wanted to pick up on something that you talked about just before the break regarding obviously a move in Ontario to get more supply, get more applications in and started and address the supply shortage. But you can't get into that conversation without recognizing some of the challenges that are faced by many municipalities, certainly in Ontario, and that is that every time an application, or I should check myself, oftentimes when an application comes before a local council, there will be opposing views. Everybody on social media and in the media in general seems to agree that we need to make housing availability a priority and housing affordability a priority. Yet when those applications come before council, there's always a group that is willing to, throw a wrench in the plan and say, that's great, but don't do it here. And that can cause a delay of 90 days to 2 years, or maybe even finish an entire project that goes against the whole goal of making availability or housing available. Thoughts on that, Tim, and thoughts on what the province might have to say about that and how that relates to local municipalities?
Yeah, very well phrased. So this new legislation, the Build More Homes Faster Act, I like it for two really big reasons. Number one, it takes on those NIMBY forces you just talked about. I had the honor of sitting on that Housing Affordability Task Force in the province that laid out how we get to the needed 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years so affordability is closer to reach. And we heard about NIMBYs all the time. In fact, it's become so bad that they've changed NIMBY, not my backyard, to a new acronym. Have you heard it?
No.
Banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. It's gotten so bad. Banana has gone bananas out there. So they take these things on and they say in this legislation that public access, sure, you can have your say, but we cannot keep abusing the process to delay, to cause projects to become more expensive or get them canceled. And I commend the province for doing that because we need to get more homes built. The second aspect, Arif, I really liked is it holds municipalities accountable. It actually assigns to about 30 of the major municipalities in Ontario housing targets. It says at least 1.5 million homes, how many will be in Barrie, how many will be in Mississauga, how many will be in Niagara Falls. And there should be a risk and reward to that. So if Barrie hits their targets or exceeds them, their highway project, their water sewer project, the new hockey arena, the hospital, whatever, that should go to the top of the provincial funding list. And if a municipality turns their back and bows down to NIMBY forces and doesn't create more homes for the young people, well, guess what? Their project should go to the bottom of the list. I like those two things a lot.
So a question for you, Trevor, though. Let's say that same policy is introduced in British Columbia. How do we ensure not just volume targets are met, but also ensuring that what we call smart growth and smart planning and responsible planning is taken into consideration so that we're not just getting quantity, but we're getting quality?
Yeah, so it is being introduced in British Columbia, or at least heavy talks about it. We had a very short-lived leadership campaign for the leadership of the provincial NDP party. David Eby, the leader in that campaign, is now going to be taking that leadership as a result of the disqualification of another candidate. And all of that, during that campaign, a lot of similar talk around potential policy and putting the pressure on municipalities to make sure that this idea of, and the word NIMBY is becoming kind of a household word, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize it stands for the acronym Not in My Backyard. So it's taking away that mentality. But to answer your question, in order to get around some of those other aspects in British Columbia, I don't know if the same is true for Ontario, but we have official community plans. So those official community plans for each municipality or jurisdiction takes generally years and a lot of money to draw up, but it does a forecast for what could be or should be in each area, and that really becomes the building blocks of the community. And what tends to happen is then a proposal is made that fits within the context of the community plan, but it's a couple of years later and somebody doesn't want that development in their backyard, so then it becomes a lobbying effort of the neighborhood and it goes to a hearing or several public hearings, and then all of a sudden it's more red tape and taking more time. I'm just going to finish with this one very brief comment, which I probably shouldn't be making because I don't necessarily know.
Oh, those are the best ones. We love them.
But but our economics department pulled some data together that actually indicated that with the expeditious nature of or making the process more expedited for development, it actually brings down the price of homes, or the average price, by upwards of 2%. And the one piece of that puzzle I don't remember off the top of my head is how much that timeline has to come down. But if houses can be built more effectively and more quickly, then it does have a positive effect on price and affordability.
Mm-hmm. Another new or newer policy that I'm seeing in British Columbia, and I'll ask Tim to follow up to see if this same such policy is being considered in Ontario, and that is introducing a cooling off period. Rather than me explaining it, you would explain it better. Maybe tell us a little bit about that, Trevor, and what you see that doing.
Yeah, I'll try to do it very briefly. The cooling off period, though kind of understood to be something that was going to help cool off the market, it is not related to the market at all. It's related to the transaction. So it gives the buyer a chance to cool off after they've made an offer and after an offer has been accepted. Mm-hmm. So the legislation states, and it'll come in January 1st in British Columbia, that the buyer has 3 days to rescind an offer, and there is a small penalty, 0.25% of the purchase price that is associated with that. But it does give them time to do due diligence. We're not seeing a market that is going to be super effective coming now or coming into 2023, but certainly in heated markets like we saw in 2020, late 2020 and all of 2021, there is opportunity to give people a little more time to do their due diligence. I'll save you the banter around all of the efforts and lobbying and kind of our position on it, but it is coming in. We are supporting 26,000 realtors to understand what that legislation looks like. But the other thing that I'll say is that it actually applies to every residential real estate transaction in the province. So this is one time that legislation doesn't just apply to those facilitating real estate transactions. It's all real estate transactions.
So I'll ask you this though, Tim, as you pick up and add your thoughts on what's going on in British Columbia, but in every real estate transaction, certainly in Ontario, it is up to the people, the parties to the transaction to either include or waive a condition of finance or a condition of inspection or any other condition that they want to apply to the transaction and risk that offer being rejected. But even once rejected, typically speaking, lawyers have a period of doing their due diligence and ensuring that there's clear title or something along those lines. So how does this actually add to it or take away from what already exists?
Yeah, I think it becomes more convoluted, and often when you bring in the cooling off periods, and I did some when I was consumer minister in Ontario, it's high pressure sales. So a door-to-door salesman, for example, that makes you sign something to buy a water heater that is a ripoff, or even the condo side where there's a lot of power on the seller side in the corporation, and the widow on the other side. When a real estate transaction, you have equal buyers and sellers, right? You have one homeowner selling to a potential homeowner, so you don't have that same uneven playing field. And obviously, we recommend they be represented by a realtor so they get the right advice and stay calm during that transaction. So I worry that has an impact on the seller, who may be counting on the value of their home then to purchase another home for their family, right, or for their retirement. You can have people playing games as well during that period to say, I might withdraw my offer unless you take, $50,000 less. So I would much rather see the government of Ontario focus on what we just talked about, getting more homes built that average Ontarians can actually afford, as opposed to mucking around in these details of the transaction.
Excellent. Well, with that in mind, I think you nailed it. I mean, if we actually address the root issue, it would save people from, as you said, mucking around with those other things to try to manipulate the markets, if you will. Those are my words, not yours. With that in mind, though, Mike, we got to go. We got any parting words from you?
No, I think that's been a great show, and hope to have you boys back on the show. This has been really enlightening for myself and hopefully for all our viewers.
Absolutely. We want to thank you both for taking your time. We wish you the very best.